French West Africa was a federation of 8 French colonial territories in Africa: Mauritania, Senegal, French Sudan, French Guinea, Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, Dahomey and Niger. The capital of the federation was Dakar. The federation existed from 1895 until 1960. History. Until after the Second World War, almost all the Africans living in the colonies of France were not citizens of France. Rather, they were French subjects, lacking rights before the law, property ownership rights, rights to travel, descent, or vote. The exception were the 4 communes of Senegal. Those areas had been towns of the tiny Senegal colony in 1848 when, at the abolition of slavery by the French Second Republic, all residents of France were granted equal political rights. Anyone able to prove they were born in these towns was legally French. They could vote in parliamentary elections, which had been previously dominated by white and copyrightless residents of Senegal. The 4 communes of Senegal were entitled to elect a deputy to represent them in the French Parliament in the years 1848 to Euro 1852, 1871 to Euro 1876, and 1879 to Euro 1940. In 1914, the first African, Blaise Diagne, was elected as the deputy for Senegal in the French Parliament. In 1916, Diagne pushed through the National Assembly a law granting full citizenship to all residents of the so-called 4 communes. In return, he had promised to help recruit millions of Africans to fight in World War I. Thereafter, all black Africans of Dakar, Gora copyrightee, St. Louis, and Rufisque could vote to send a representative to the French National Assembly. As the French pursued their part in the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, they conquered large inland areas, and at first ruled them as either a part of the Senegal colony, or as independent entities. These conquered areas were usually governed by French army officers, and dubbed military territories. In the late 1890s, the French government began to rein in the territorial expansion of its officers on the ground, and transferred all the territories west of Gabon to a single governor based in Senegal, reporting directly to the Minister of Overseas Affairs. The first Governor-General of Senegal was named in 1895, and in 1904, the territories he oversaw were formally named French West Africa. Gabon would later become the seat of its own federation, French Equatorial Africa, which was to border its western neighbor on the modern boundary between Niger and Chad. After the fall of France in June 1940 and the 2 battles of Dakar against the Free French forces in July and September 1940, authorities in West Africa declared allegiance to the Vichy regime, as did the colony of French Gabon in AEF. While the latter fell to Free France already after the Battle of Gabon in November 1940, West Africa remained under Vichy control until the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942. Following World War II, the French government began a process of extending limited political rights in its colonies. In 1945, the French Provisional Government allocated 10 seats to French West Africa in the new Constituent Assembly called to write a new French constitution. Of these, 5 would be elected by citizens and 5 by African subjects. The elections brought to prominence a new generation of French-educated Africans. On October 21, 1945, 6 Africans were elected. The 4 communes' citizens chose Lamine Gueye, Senegal, Mauritania, La Copyright Apoldzar Copyright Dasenga, Ivory Coast, Upper Volta Far Copyright Lix Hufua Boigny, Dahomey Togo Soro Miga Napathy, Sudan Niger Fili Dabo Sissoko, and Guinea Yaka Diallo. They were all re-elected to the Second Constituent Assembly on June 2, 1946. In 1946, Deloy Lamine Gueye granted some limited citizenship rights to natives of the African colonies. The French Empire was renamed the French Union on October 27, 1946, when the new constitution of the French Fourth Republic was established. In late 1946, under this new constitution, each territory was for the first time able to elect local representatives, albeit on a limited franchise, to newly established general councils. These elected bodies had only limited consultative powers, although they did approve local budgets. The Loi Cadre of June 23, 1956 brought universal suffrage to elections held after that date in all French African colonies. The first elections under universal suffrage in French West Africa were the municipal elections of late 1956. On March 31, 1957, under universal suffrage, territorial assembly elections were held in each of the 8 colonies. The leaders of the winning parties were appointed to the newly instituted positions of vice presidents of the respective governing councils. French colonial governors remained as presidents. The Constitution of the French Fifth Republic of 1958 again changed the structure of the colonies from the French Union to the French Community. Each territory was to become a protectorate, with the Consultative Assembly named a National Assembly. The governor appointed by the French was renamed the High Commissioner, and made head of state of each territory. The Assembly would name an African as head of government with advisory powers to the head of state. Legally, the federation ceased to exist after the September 1958 referendum to approve this French community. All the colonies except Guinea voted to remain in the new structure. Guineans voted overwhelmingly for independence. In 1960, a further revision of the French constitution, compelled by the failure of the French Indochina War and the tensions in Algeria, allowed members of the French community to unilaterally change their own constitutions. Senegal and former French Sudan became the Mali Federation, while Ivory Coast, Niger, Upper Volta and Dahomey subsequently formed the short-lived Sahel-Benin Union, later the Conseil de l'Entente. Territorial changes. The administrative structure of French colonial possessions in West Africa, while more homogeneous than neighboring British possessions, was marked by variety and flux. Throughout the history of the AOF, individual colonies and military territories were reorganized numerous times, as was the Government General in Dakar. French Upper Volta was formed and parcelled out to neighboring colonies twice. The future states of Mauritania and Niger remained out of the federation until the 1920s and 1940s respectively. They were military territories, directly controlled by the French army. World War II, and the passing of the Loicada, both radically restructured the administration of the colonies. French Togoland, seized by France from Germany in World War I, was for most of this period not nominally a colony but a mandate territory. Federal structure. In theory, the Governors-General of the AOF reported directly to the Minister of Colonies in Paris, while individual colonies and territories reported only to Dakar. Originally created in 1895 as a union of Senegal, French Sudan, French Guinea and Ivory Coast only, the federation was placed on a permanent footing in 1904. The Governor-General was based first in St. Louis, then in Dakar. The AOF subsequently expanded to neighboring French-ruled territories. Dahomey was added in 1904, after having been put under colonial tutelage in 1892. Mauritania in 1920, and when the territory of Upper Volta was divided from French Sudan by colonial decree in 1921, it automatically also entered the AOF. Between 1934 and 1937, the League of Nations Mandate territory of French Togoland was subsumed into Dahomey, and between its seizure from Germany in World War I and independence it was administered through the AOF. In 1904, both Mauritania and Niger were classed military territories ruled by the AOF in conjunction with officers of the French colonial forces. Colonial administration. Each colony of French West Africa was administered by a lieutenant governor, responsible to the Governor-General in Dakar. Only the Governor-General received orders from Paris, via the Minister of Colonies. The minister, with the approval of the French National Assembly, chose lieutenants governor and governors-general. Governors-general Grand Council of French West Africa beginning in 1946, a Grand Council of French West Africa was created in Dakar. 2 representatives from each colony, usually the lieutenant governor and a representative of the French population there, were seated. This council had only consultative powers over the office of the Governor-General. The functioning of such bodies rested upon the Indigo Copyright Nat Legal Code of 1885. Local administration. Despite this state of flux, and with the exception of the Senegalese communes, the administrative structure of French rule at the lower levels remained constant, based upon the cartel system. This was the smallest unit of French political administration in French colonial Africa that was headed by a European officer. They might range in size, but French Sudan consisted of less than a dozen carcels for most of its existence. Thus, a carcel commander might be the absolute authority over hundreds of thousands of Africans. Carcels equals, a carcel consisted of several cantons, each of which in turn consisted of several villages, and was almost universal in France's African colonies from 1895 to 1946. The carcel commander was subject to the authority of a district commander, and the government of the colony above him, but was independent of the military structure. Below the carcel commander were a series of African chefs de canton, and chefs du village chiefs appointed by the French and subject to removal by the Europeans. As well, the carcel commander made use of a large number of servants, employees, and African officers such as the Gardes de Carcel police, any military units seconded to them by government authorities, and sub-administrators such as the Preceptor du Marché copyright trade inspectors, etc. Because of administrative practice and geographic isolation, carcel commanders had a tremendous amount of power over the lives of the Africans around them. The carcel commanders also had tremendous power over the economic and political life of their territories. Legally, all Africans outside the four communes of Senegal were subjects under the Indigo Copyright Nat Legal Code of 1885. This code gave summary powers to French administrators, including the rights to arrest, try, punish and imprison subjects. It also gave French local authorities the right to requisition forced labor, usually limited to able-bodied men for a few weeks a year, but in practice having few restrictions. These tools included the civilizing mission ideology common in the period following the First World War. Every new carcel commander might well bring with him vast projects for development and the restructuring of the people's lives he governed. Chiefs equals, the other official office particular to the local administration of French West Africa was the chief. These were Africans appointed by French officials for their loyalty to France, regardless of their rights to local power. These chiefs were assigned created territories based on the scale of a French canton, as well as on the small-scale tribal structures the French found in the coastal areas of the Rivières du Sud colony in the 1880s, modern Guinea. The canton, then, was much smaller than, and qualitatively different from, the pre-colonial states of the Sahel which the French would later conquer. They were styled chefs de canton, chefs du village, or occasionally taking the title of pre-colonial states assimilated by the French structure whole. This last was uncommon, but became more prevalent in the later colonial territories conquered, as fewer administrators were available to rule over larger, less populated territories with strong pre-colonial state structures. Where these larger polities resisted the French, they were often broken into small chiefdoms. Larger polities which presented a segment of the elite who would work with the French, were maintained under new leadership. The Sultan of Agades, the Sultan of Damgaram, and the Jermacoy of Dessau are examples of these large-scale chefs de canton. But even these rulers were replaced by individuals hand-picked by French authorities. Regardless of source, chiefs were given the right to arm small numbers of guards and made responsible for the collection of taxes, the recruitment of forced labor, and the enforcement of customary law. In general, canton chiefs served at the behest of their carcel commander, and were left to see to their own affairs as long as calm was maintained and administrative orders were carried out. Geography. With an area of some 4,689,000 square kilometers extending from Africa's westernmost point to the depths of the Sahara, the Federation contained more than 10 million inhabitants at its creation, and some 25 million at its dissolution. The AOF included all of the Senegal River Valley, most of the Niger River Valley, and most of the West African Sahel region. It also included tropical forests in Ivory Coast and Guinea, the Fouta Djallon Highlands, and the Ore Mountains of modern Niger. Territories Ivory Coast, Dahomey, French Sudan, Guinea, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, Upper Volta, French Togoland. See also: colonialism, decolonization, Frena section Afrique, 4 communes, Frena section Noir Victor Permel Quebec, French colonial empire. List of French possessions and colonies, postage stamps and postal history of French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, French colonial flags. References. Further reading, Aldrich, Robert. Greater France, A History of French Overseas Expansion. Palgrave Macmillan ISBN 0-312-16000-3. Jean Charette-Knail. French Colonialism in Tropical Africa, 1900–1945. New York, 1971 Conklin. Alice L. Mission to Civilize, The Republican Idea of Empire in France and West Africa 1895–1930. Stanford, Stanford University Press ISBN 978-0-8047-2999-4. Crawford Young. The African Colonial State in Comparative Perspective. Yale University Press ISBN 0-300-06879-4. Lusignan, Guida. French-Speaking Africa Since Independence, Manning, Patrick. Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa, 1880–1995. Cambridge University Press ISBN 0-521-64255-8. Thompson, Virginia and Richard Adloff. French West Africa. External links, Map of the progression of French expansion in West Africa in the period 1885–1920. Related maps of French West African expansion are at sandayfair.com, Sandayfair Stamp Atlas, French West Africa. Dated 2000, retrieved January 2008.